Okay, I'm in my little reading cubby hole again, so let's continue. And this next chapter was actually fairly long, so just preparing you for that. And this was February, one second here. You know what? I'm like so tired. February 1972. I forgot the year for a second. Isn't that crazy when the year is right in the title of the book? So, you know, it's interesting the way this book is organized because it has all the, you can see there, the chapter subheadings here, but they don't reappear again during the chapters. Instead, I'm going to show you, find a good example. He just divides them with it, like that little hat-like symbol, which I assume is where a subtitle would go. So I'm wondering if that's the same number. I'm just so curious here. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Now let's see if there's 7 of those little hat symbols. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. No, I think there's more than that. 7, 8, 9. No, so I really don't know the correlation because these titles seem to be like subchapter titles, which are, for February, Fear and Loathing in New Hampshire, Back on the Campaign Trail in Manchester, Keene and the Booth Fish Hatcheries, Harold Hughes, not Howard Hughes, Harold Hughes is your friend, Weird Memories of 68, A Private Conversation with Richard Nixon, Will Dope Doom the Cowboys, A First Massive and Reluctantly Final Judgment on the Reality of George McGovern, and lastly, Small Hope for the Hammer and No Hope at All for the Press Wizards. Now, I'm really starting to get a sense for this book, and I understand some of the criticisms. Some people just said they just couldn't deal with Hunter's style. And I get that because it is so chaotic, frenetic. Like, you kind of get tired reading it. Like the text moves. I don't know if I'm describing that right, but it's just full of frenetic energy. And it can be, it's not a typical style. It can be disjointed, but not like in a bad writing way, in a very planned way. If, again, I might not be describing this the best way. If you're reading this with me, I think you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. So with this long chapter, he's hitting the trail. He's hitting the trail starting in New Hampshire with the New Hampshire primaries. And most of it is detailing out just like the general activities. And I just want to highlight a few things. But he does go back to some memories of 68, where he hung out with Richard Nixon. Now, this guy's a Democrat. So, you know, no Nixon fan whatsoever. But apparently, out of the press corps, Nixon wanted someone to be able to hang out and distract him with football talk. And Hunter was the only one who could really do that, and they forbid him from going on about Vietnam, the draft, or anything like that. He just needed to talk with Richard Nixon about football. And apparently, Nixon knew a lot about football and trivia, and that really impressed Hunter. So there's some interesting stories there. But they were at this airfield. Nixon was there, staffers were there, and apparently, you know, we're so used to today's airports. And even I remember when they weren't like they are today. But even if you look at some vintage films, like you would get on the planes. Well, you see even now with the president, they don't go through that long tube like we do. You know, you go up an actual staircase. But that used to be typical for everybody. So you'd be able to be out on the tarmac amongst the hustle and bustle. And apparently Hunter was out there talking and like leaning over railings, looking at stuff and just smoking a cigarette away. And like, apparently he almost blew up the fuel tanks or something. And what he said was, well, actually, one of the staffers with him said, "What worries me is that nobody else noticed this. Christ, those guys get paid to protect the boss." And that is a sobering realization, isn't it? And so he spent a while with Nixon on his tour bus, and he said he was probably the only press person there who regularly referred to the candidate as the dingbat. So, continuing, there's a lot of, I've noticed, big cars, like those classic big metal hunks that people still like, you know, but it's the type of cars that really aren't made today out of solid metal. So it just seems like he's hopping into one big car to another, but right here he cranked the big Green Cougar. And in describing the New Hampshire primaries, and it is so great, like the way I'm getting a feel for this 72 election season. He says the electorate in this state is notoriously perverse and unpredictable. And he spends a good deal of time talking about young people. And I get the impression he was fairly young here, but when I'm saying young people, I mean barely out of teens, you know, 18, 19, 20, early 20s. And how absolutely politically disinterested they were. But what I mean by politically is like elections. They obviously were concerned about things such as Vietnam, you know, current issues, but completely uninvolved and uninterested in the American political process. And he picked up this hitchhiker who was going to this weird commune, and he was worried about her and was considering just bringing her back to the Nixon bus, but realized that wouldn't work out. And he said, actually, it wasn't the Nixon bus. Excuse me. That was a flashback now back to the current day with McGovern. And he says, well, it wouldn't work out. She was a strange girl, and a political campaign is a very narrow ritual where anything weird is unwelcome. I would imagine that's still true today. Very plastic. And then, apparently, there was something in Democratic circles then called the RadLib Caucus, which threw its weight to see what Democratic candidate they were going to support in the primary. And apparently this was a big thing in 68, so a lot of people were looking forward to it in 72. And Gene McCarthy was a big splash in 68 and expected that to happen again in 72, but there was an upset. McGovern beat McCarthy 3-1, and actually Shirley Grisham narrowly beat McCarthy, but she came out of the blue. So he says the outcome of the Massachusetts RadLib Caucus was a shock to almost everybody except the busloads of McGovern supporters who had come there to flex their muscle in public for the first time. McCarthy, who had left early to fly back to Washington for an appearance the next day on Meet the Press, was seriously jolted by the loss. So all of these upsets. And he really goes into how Grisham's, and here's a picture of Shirley Grisham. These are all black and white, so it isn't very detailed. But she was a dynamic black woman. And, yeah, so it says that she beat Gene McCarthy, who finished a close third. And this one paragraph is interesting. The Grisham challenge was a last-minute idea and only half organized on the morning of the caucus by a handful of speedy young black politicos and women's lib types, but by 6 p.m. that evening, it had developed from a noisy idea into a solid power block. What began as a symbolic kind of challenge became a serious position after the first ballot amongst this overwhelmingly white, liberal, affluent, well-educated, and over 30 audience, when almost half of them refused to vote for George McGovern because he seemed too conventional. Now, at the pre-caucus rally, he was noticing how it was different demographics. At the pre-caucus rally where McCarthy was riling everyone up, it was all young people, like up through 25. And then at the actual caucus, it was 25 and up. And he noticed this dearth and like almost absence of 25 to 35-year-olds. And he had wondered what would happen if the demographic of the 25s and unders, which was for the pre-caucus rally, actually came to the actual caucus to skew the age range down. Perhaps Shirley Grisham would have taken it. So he says, it is interesting to speculate about what might have happened if the same people who showed up at McCarthy's Holy Cross rally on Friday night had come out to Assumption on Sunday. And then he said this same weird age pattern seemed to prevail at all of the McGovern appearances. The crowds were always a mix of people either under 20 or over 40. Noticeably barren of people between 25 and 35. Now that is really interesting. He speaks of the disappointments that happen along the way and how McGovern was seriously disappointed from a friend, Senator Harold Hughes, who announced that he would be endorsing Ed Muskie instead of McGovern. And interestingly here, he speaks of the chair of the DNC and, you know, the internal battles. But there was something described here about a battle for the chairmanship of the all-important credentialing committee at the National Convention. Now, I'm used to LP conventions where, I mean, the credentials committee, there are sometimes some controversies, such as I remember in 2016 over the Oregon delegates, but not so often. And I can't imagine ever calling the chairmanship like of the all-important credentialing committee for the LP. So I wonder what kind of funny business was going on there. So he had said, a lot has been written about McGovern's difficulties on the campaign trail, but most of it is far off the point. The career polls and press wizards say he simply lacks charisma, but that's a cheap and simplistic idea that is more an insult to the electorate than to McGovern. The assholes who run politics in this country have become so mesmerized by the Madison Avenue School of Campaigning that they actually believe now that all it takes to become a congressman or a senator or even a president is a nice set of teeth, a big wad of money, and a half dozen media specialists. A lot still think that today. And then here's where we get into some of the things again. The racial sensitivities and the sensitivities we have to certain offensive words just didn't exist then. And surrounding Shirley Grisham, a lot of the N-word was thrown around, and even just reading it makes me very uncomfortable. And accusations of closet racism, which it's interesting considering to me, this seems like there's a lot of open racism. Also was part and parcel of politics then as it is today. Now, McGovern's main man, it says, I would say it's one of his head staffers, was described here as a fat young Pole named, and Pole here is P-O-L, not short for Polish P-O-L-E, but Joel Grandmason, whose personal style hovers somewhere between that of a state trooper and a used car salesman. That is quite descriptive. But I love this little exchange here. He says, Grandmason was eager to nail Muskie. If we elect a president who 3 years ago said, gee, I made a mistake, well, I think it's about time these people were held accountable for these mistakes. Indeed. But when Grandmason backed away from me like he had stepped on a rattlesnake, when I asked him if it were true that he'd been a Johnson delegate to the Chicago Convention in '68. We met at a McGovern cocktail party in a downstate hamlet called Keene, which is now the hotbed of the Free State Project. Let's talk about this word accountable, I said. I get the feeling you stepped in shit on that one. What do you mean, he snapped? Just because I was a Johnson delegate doesn't mean anything. I'm not running for office. It's funny how everyone's accountable except one's selves. Now, one of the hot political issues of this time was amnesty for draft dodgers, and McGovern was the first major political candidate to unequivocally say that he supported amnesty. And part of the problem, even though a lot of politicians may have secretly supported it, was that it basically was a tacit admission that the Vietnam War was wrong, which nobody wanted to do, because it would be, and I'm quoting here, especially painful to the people who got their sons shipped back to them in rubber sacks, and to the thousands of young vets who got their arms and their legs and their balls blown off for what the White House and Ed Muskie now admit was a mistake. When this war goes into the history books, the United States Air Force will rank as the most efficient gang of murderers in the history of man. And he says the only candidates at this point in favor of amnesty were McGovern and Ted Kennedy. And the Kennedys keep coming up throughout this book, like there's a fear that one of them would be running, but they never did. And this reminds me so much of Kamala Harris here, where there was an awkward moment where someone in the crowd asked McGovern if he would be supporting Muskie if Muskie won the primary or got the nomination, and he said he would. And the crowd, who was so amped up with his idealism as being for amnesty, was then deflated, because he's like, you're standing here saying Muskie is wrong on nearly everything, yet you would support him? That is the inherent problems with politics and party above all. So the hunter said, I doubt I was the only person in the hall at that moment who thought, well, shit, if you plan to support him in July, why not just support him now and get it over with? And there's a paragraph here that just doesn't go into more detail, where Hunter's talking about hanging out outside, and he said he was on the sidewalk shooting up with Ray Morgan. And I found myself wondering, was that like a colloquial figure of speech then, or does he literally mean like they were shooting drugs up? He does so much drugs in this book, it's hard to tell. But I can't imagine him standing on the sideway like shooting heroin or something. But he doesn't go into any further details, so I guess I don't know. And he does an interesting turn of the phrase water under the bridge. He says a lot of blood has gone under the bridge. And of course, the speculations about the new youth vote. And he says, if you give 25 million people a new toy, the odds are pretty good that a lot of them will try it at least once. But this was his concern. But what about next time? Who's going to explain in 1976 that all the people who felt they got burned in 72 should try again for another bogus challenger? Absolutely. And what he faulted McGovern for was actually a virtue, but it's a fault in politics, that McGovern just tended to say what he really thought about things. And it says he has refused to modify his stand on the school busing issue, which Nixon-Wallace strategists say will be the #1 campaign argument by midsummer. One of those wild-eyed fire and brimstone issues that scares the piss out of politicians because there is no way to dodge it. But McGovern went out of his way to make sure people understood that he was for busing, not because it's desirable, but because it's among the prices we are paying for a century of segregation in our housing patterns. Now, I'm going to say here, it might be a little controversial, but something I am noticing as we go back here, immediately post civil rights era and obviously post Jim Crow, is that ever since that time, there have been efforts to balance things out that you could even call a mild form, at least, of reparations. I mean, such as affirmative action and things like that. And it, to me, it does leave credence to the fact that that's a train that never ends. Now, I'm not even making a judgment on that, because I've been known to say, and I can't say I'm absolutely convinced of this, but I am fairly convinced of it, that because we were born in slavery while claiming to be the land of the free, that we were doomed from the womb as a country. That slavery was a mortal wound at our inception, and we're still just bleeding out. He says McGovern is the only candidate, including Lindsay and Muskie, who invariably gives a straight answer when people raise questions. He lines out the painful truth, and his reward has been just about the same as that of any other politician who insists on telling the truth. He is mocked, vilified, ignored, and abandoned as a hopeless loser by even his good old buddies. On the face of it, the McGovern problem looks like the ultimate proof positive for the liberal cynic's conviction that there is no room in American politics for an honest man. Now, you can see throughout here his building, perhaps begrudging respect for McGovern, and his lack of respect for the Democratic Party chair at that time, and who he did not have. Apparently, the Democratic Party chair was calling the Democrats the loyal opposition, which Hunter seemed to find very rich. And Larry O'Brien, that is who the chair was. So Hunter says, remember the Whigs, Larry? They went belly up with no warning at all when a handful of young politicians like Abe Lincoln decided to move out on their own and fuck the Whigs, which worked out very nicely. And when it became almost instantly clear that the Whig hierarchy was just a gang of old, impotent windbags with no real power at all, the party just curled up and died. And any politician stupid enough to stay loyal went down with the ship. And though he says this is, though, actually McGovern's weakness, that he is a Democrat through and through, a party person. And he says that he spent 2 weeks brooding on these issues because, and this is his words speaking about him, I like McGovern, which still surprises me because politicians, like journalists, are pretty hard people to like. The only other group I've ever dealt with who struck me as being essentially meaner than politicians are tight ends in pro football. And he speaks of the change in political comment from the political culture, maybe, from the 1960s, where he said, during the 60s, most Americans believed that whoever lived in the White House was naturally a righteous and upstanding man, or he wouldn't be there. But the shit train began on 63, when a twisted little geek blew the president's head off. And then a year later, LBJ was reelected as the peace candidate. And he basically says everything went downhill from there. And he says that Johnson will emerge in his proper role as the man who caused an entire generation of Americans to lose all respect for the presidency, the White House, the Army, and in fact, the whole structure of government. And he also gets into the the right wing and the left wing are just the same wing of the same nasty bird. So he says no matter what happens, pretty much nothing's going to change. And the way he put it is, if the Republicans win, we will immediately declare limited nuclear war on all of Indochina, and the IRS will start collecting a 20% national sales tax on every dollar spent by anybody for the national defense emergency. If the Democrats win, Congress will begin a 14-year debate on whether or not to declare massive conventional war on all of Indochina, and the IRS will begin collecting a 20% national losers tax on all incomes under $25,000 per annum for the national defense emergency. So basically, the same result no matter what. And again, back on his little drug thing, he says, the latest craze on the local high life front is mixing up 6 or 8 aspirins in a fresh Coca-Cola and doing it all at once. What the hell is that supposed to do? I mean, anyone ever heard of that? Just seems strange for me. And at this point, the smart people, the word among the wizards, as he put it, is that Muskie was the shoo-in for the Democratic nomination. And now we know, obviously, that didn't happen, but that had been what everyone was saying. Now, interesting, we have a picture here of McGovern with his campaign manager, Gary Hart. Is that the same Gary Hart who was a presidential contender until his affair with Jennifer Flowers became public? Is that the same guy? I think it is. And he concludes this chapter with saying, I thought I was missing all the action because I wasn't plugged in. But then I began reading the press wizards who are plugged in, and it didn't take long to figure out that most of them were just filling space because their contracts said they had to write a certain amount of words each week. That, there was just no, at least in January, passion in this whole thing. It says they all seem very depressed, not only about the 72 election, but about the whole long-range future of politics and democracy in America. Which is not exactly the kind of question we really need to come to grips with right now. The nut of the problem is that covering this presidential campaign is so fucking dull that it's barely tolerable. And the only thing worse than going out in the campaign trail and getting hauled around in a booze frenzy from one speech to another is having to come back to Washington and write about it. That does sound depressing. So that is it for February 73. We will be going on to March. I think this is a fairly short chapter. Yeah, it's the typical 20 or so pages, unlike this one. Let's just take a look here because I'm curious. 30 to 70. So, which is more was closer to 40 pages. All right. I'll be talking to you guys soon. Bye-bye.